what we're working on in a nutshell is criminalising serious harm to nature. In other words, making it a crime to severely destroy the environment. Because as we're seeing, we all kind of know what direction we need to be going in, but our governments are going very slowly. Business is moving at a kind of crawling pace compared to what we know needs to happen, and that's despite a number of sort of sustainability leaders being kind of out front. And what we believe is essentially missing is the kind of criminal law framework that actually could guide things in the right direction. So we aim to have ecocide, or mass damage and destruction of nature, criminalised alongside war crimes, genocide, crimes against humanity at the top level, so at the international level of an international crime. And one of the key reasons for this is that although there's a body of environmental laws around the world, there's lots of there's lots of regulations. Most of it is in the civil law arena, or in kind of soft law treaties, and it's clearly not being enforced. And there are some environmental crimes as well, but it's clearly not being enforced with anything like the level that it needs to be. And also we have a situation where as far as industry is concerned, as long as you're not breaking criminal law, your priority legally is actually to make money for your shareholders. So, so there's also a kind of existing situation which is creating effectively an exacerbatory factor for both climate change and biodiversity loss, which I always think is a crazy way of describing the effective sort of destruction and extinction of nature at an incredible rate. It makes it sound like it's something you kind of dropped out of your back pocket. Oh, I lost my biodiversity. When actually what we're looking at, of course, is really serious levels of harm, whether that's deforestation, whether that's oil spills, whether that's industrial fishing that kind of rakes up half the seabed and destroys marine environments. I mean, there's so many examples where industrial practices that are just normal and part of our global economy at their worst, create really huge levels of destruction. So we've been working on this for over 10 years. It was pioneered by a UK barrister called Polly Higgins, who came across the concept and realised that this was something that needed to be, brought into the open. And she really sort of worked on making that, bringing that concept into the world and talking to people at all levels. She actually passed away 3 years ago after a very rapid cancer. And it was one of those situations where somebody who's championed something for a long time sometimes is seen by everybody else as the person that's doing the work. So they kind of sit back and don't do anything. So, you don't need to do anything about this. Polly's doing it. And actually what happened when she passed away, as her closest associate, I suddenly found there were lawyers, politicians, campaigners getting in touch with me saying, this work must continue. We have got to move this forward. And in those short 3 years, it's been an incredible sort of exercise in dot joining and connecting people and, growing the conversation. And we're now in a situation where we have a consensus legal definition of ecocide, of what that means. Our foundation convened a panel of 12 top lawyers from around the world last year who came up with this definition, which is so concise, the core of it, that it fits on a business card, which makes it super helpful for conveying to people. And it's simply, ecocide means unlawful or wanton acts committed with knowledge that there's a substantial likelihood of severe and either widespread or long-term damage to the environment being caused by those acts. So it's really, really quite straightforward. I mean, there's a further paragraph that explains the definition of the terms, but that definition is gaining significant political traction around the world. There's now 21 countries which are members of the International Criminal Court, which have on public record now conversations around this, either at parliamentary or government level. So this is something that has momentum and is seriously moving forward. And we're spending a lot of time trying to get the language of ecocide and the language of criminal law frameworks into high-level UN events and so on. But we also we're kind of in this interesting position where we're in between the legal developments, the political traction, and also the public narrative. And we recently had a piece of research gifted to us by some funders, which showed that it was based in the UK, and it did a kind of public survey. And what they found was that the vast majority of people if you ask them and you explain, do you think that serious destruction of nature should be a crime, and that should there be this kind of hard stop parameter so that companies and and policymakers can't do more that they can't do really serious damage, and they have to think about that before they make those decisions, the response is overwhelmingly positive, in the sense that for most people this is a no-brainer, and it's kind of crazy in a way that it hasn't been put in place before. But this comes down, in many ways, it comes down to our kind of mindset that's been developed over decades, if not hundreds of years, really, where we see ourselves as separate to nature. We see nature as a bank of resources, and that our whole economy is based on effectively extraction, and kind of using up the resources that we see around us. We're already using, if everybody existed the way that we do in the West, we'd already need several planets to actually sustain it. So what we see this as is a really quite a simple but umbrella solution that can actually enable countries, governments, but also businesses at all levels to look at the longer term effects of what the decisions that they're making, and be able to, for example, say to their shareholders, do you know what, we can't do that because that's actually going to be criminal in a few years. So we're going to have to look at new and strategic positive change in terms of how we approach things. And I think this can be really helpful, particularly because I think so many of us feel, in a sense, complicit in what's happening around the world. And of course, the corporate PR machine has done a great job of making individuals feel guilty and responsible for what's happening to the climate and what's happening to nature. And in truth, a lot of the key decisions that lead to, if I go into a supermarket and everything is packaged in plastic, I didn't decide that. Yes, of course, as a consumer, I can say I prefer something else. But effectively, the decisions that lead to that situation are made at the kind of top levels of government and industry. The same is true of fossil fuel cars. I actually drive a fossil fuel car because I live in the countryside. I've got to get my kids around the place, and I can't afford an electric car. And that is a decision that is based on the options available to me. It's based on the fact that, government subsidies go towards fossil fuels, and don't go towards renewables, for example. So looking at changing the law at that highest level could actually have really huge ramifications across all levels of industry, plus support all of those who are trying to do the right thing, leveling that playing field. Because at the moment, if you're trying to do something sustainable, often what you're doing is ending up costing more because you're having to kind of go ahead of the curve, whereas those who are willing to continue in the old practices or destructive practices, it's cheaper for them. And so effectively that continues in its old groove. So there's a way in which bringing that framework into play both levels the playing field and channels future action into the right direction. So as I said, there's a way in which this is kind of a no-brainer. It's like, well, why wouldn't you put something like this in place? Why isn't it already in place? But at the same time, it's still relatively unknown. So not that many people actually know about this actually rapidly growing global movement. And even at government level, there was a big discussion in the Danish Parliament last week, I think, or the week before, where it was proposed for the government to consider criminalising ecocide and supporting an international crime of ecocide. Most of those parliamentarians hadn't even heard the word. Not only that, but a lot of them weren't even aware of how serious the climate and ecological crisis is. So what we're looking at is a major kind of deficit in people's understanding still, despite the fact that, these big international reports have come out that are telling us how urgent everything is. So from our perspective, there's a real potential in the sports world for raising awareness around this, because there's such a reach that's available in the world of athletics, in the world of sport, in the world of football, in the world of so many sports, because there's a really sort of strong access to public knowledge, to providing knowledge to the public. So there's a real kind of potential there, I think. But just, I hope that that's given you just a little bit of a kind of flavour of the potential of what we're working on. And very, very happy to take questions, discuss further, come back and talk about it more, all of that. So yeah, I'll leave it there for now, but really, really happy to discuss further.